Continuing or maybe concluding our series on our unit guides, we have the final one in the series, the Imperial unit guide. Now, up to this point, there have been a number of changes to all of the factions and their units. So before we get started, go ahead and let me know in the comment section below, what you guys would prefer. Do you want an updated unit guide for each one, which I think we probably will do by the time the game actually officially launches in March or April? Or do you want me to do an updated one video catches all of the little updates and kind of re-evaluate the ones that have drastically changed? An example would be the Battanian Oathsworn has had some tweaking to its equipment that would change its grade that we've given it before. So go ahead and let me know in the comment section below. If this is your first time jumping into one of these videos, essentially what we're going to be doing is going through the entire Empire unit roster, starting with Tier 2. Tier 1 is a recruit and everyone kind of shares roughly the same traits. And I'm going to grade these or rank these either low, medium, or high. And I will be comparing them versus their other counterparts across the various other factions. So before we get started, in my typical fashion of liking to front load the information, my overall consensus with the Empire is that it is a faction that has amazing armor, but low to medium damage output. And we're going to see this kind of put across almost every single portion of their roster. And I will also say that the one big advantage of Empire is that they're very uniform. Almost every single equipment loadout is the same from 1, 2, and 3. There's 3 typical equipment loadouts, and usually they vary from some of the other factions to factions. With the Empire, it's all the same per 3 for a couple exceptions in here. So let's get started with our Empire unit guide and dive in on our first tier in Tier 2. And Tier 2 for the Empire is a really strong start. Before we actually jump in though, I do want to give a quick shout out to my little Tantan and his mod, Equipment and Encyclopedia. It's enabled me to do a really big, nice drill down on all these unit guides. You can find a link in the description, but it'll allow me to go through every variation of the battle and civilian equipment, as well as allowing me to average all of the armor across the sets in case there's any variations from set to set. Now, starting with the Imperial Infantryman, we have a very strong Tier 2 infantry soldier. And the benefit of having a strong Tier 2 infantry soldier is this allows you to have strong soldiers that will make it to Tiers 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. So having a weak one just makes filling in the gaps later in the game very difficult. So they have the best overall armor across head, body, arm, and legs. It's just very nice, very solid, but they have around mid-range damage. They have with the Iron Spatha, which brings in about 55 swing damage. Everything else having in the higher range for Battania in 60, or the lower range around 50, 51, 52. So they're just about a mid-range. Now the biggest downfall to the Imperial Infantryman is that he is one of the only ones without a spear. And this is going to be a point of contention until we get into the later tiers in 4 and 5. But that brings our Imperial Infantryman to the table here. Very strong. I'm going to give this one a high rank because it is, again, a really solid Tier 2, well-rounded infantry soldier. Now, moving over to the Imperial Archer, we have an interesting dilemma. This is the only true Tier 2 archer that uses a bow. The rest either use a crossbow in the example of Volandia, or they use a throwing weapon for pretty much everyone else, or they just don't have something to compare. Or it's in the noble line. And that's, I guess, worth mentioning if you've never watched one of these videos. The noble line, I compare outside of the usual rank and file, and they get their own section that we'll go into at the end of everything. But the Imperial Archer here, all said and done, I mean, it's still the best Tier 2 archer because there's no other competition. It has a decent enough bow with the hunting bow. It's just a nice, base Tier 1 hunting bow, nothing crazy here. And again, still solid armor at 8, 12, 2, and 12, comparing to the other throwing classes that actually have pretty meager armor. Now, one downfall, and this is a downfall that we're going to be seeing repeated across almost all the archers, is there's only one stack of arrows. So keep that in mind as we move forward into the other ones. But I would give this one a high rank because, again, it is the only one in its field, and also has a nice spike club, so it can do some good damage to armor in the mid to late portions of the game. But just to recap here, Imperial Infantryman, high grade or high rank, and the Imperial Archer, a high rank as well. But let's move into Tier 3. Another strong showing here with tier 3, starting with the Imperial Trained Infantrymen. One note that I've got from you guys is wanting these to be a little bit more concise and a little bit quicker. So I'm trying to get through tiers 2 and 3 to get to 4 and 5 faster because they're the bigger, meatier portions of the army list. And let me know in the comments section below if this is a pace that you're enjoying. But overall, for the Trained Infantrymen, we again have that same exact, not even conundrum, but the same exact cookie cutter that we're going to see with the best armor across every body piece and across every single other faction, but again mid-range. Taking a look here, we're now with a Spatha with a narrow fuller, bringing us at a swing damage of around 64. Everything else is very close. Like 65 is slightly above it, but it's still above it. And other things like 61, so on and so forth. Like Azurai has 61 on its hammer or mace, so at least the Azurai has crushing damage that it can take advantage of, but it does less overall, I guess you could say, damage compared to the Spatha with narrow fuller. In addition, now we don't get a spear, we get simple javelins. We get throwing ability at tier 3 for our Trained Infantrymen, which is really solid and very strong. I really like this, but you do have to keep in mind, if you're sticking with a pure Imperial army, Imperial Trained Infantrymen, you're going to want in their own category, and we'll discuss it when we go to 4 and 5. And it's simply because you want them to use their javelins. It's not going to circumvent their functionality, as it were. But it's worth noting that you want to put them in their own category, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But I think outside of that, the only difference here is you don't have a spear. You have 70 one-handed and 70 throwing. Everyone else, for the most part, I think it's 3 of the 6 other factions, have a spear, and they have 70 polearm and 70 one-handed. So you're basically swapping that skill to get throwing in there. Now moving over to our trained archer, we're going to see the first time that they get actual competition from Khazate. Khazate actually has a tier 3 archer, but again, very similar situation. Oh, and by the way, Imperial Trained Infantrymen, high rank, if that wasn't obvious enough. But the Imperial Trained Archer here, moving back to that, very good armor. It's kind of the big thing for the Empire is to have decent enough armor, but the bow is okay. It's still a mountain hunting bow, so it's not that awesome, but you are only having 1 stack of arrows. It is such a hamstring to the archer to only have 20 shots on. This is the sole purpose of this unit. So I'm going to give this a mid-rank by comparison to the other archers in the tier 3 bracket, when there's only other one, but at least that other one has more arrows at its disposal, and the Imperial Trained Archer just kind of is lackluster for it being an archer. So recapping real quick, high rank on that Trained Infantryman, very solid, great armor. Mid rank though on the Imperial Trained Archer, just because it just kind of can't really bring what it's supposed to do to the table as strong as other ones in its class. Getting a bit spicier here as we move into tier 4, and this is where we get some real big changes to the dynamic of things. So starting with the Imperial Veteran Infantryman, we have the exact same thing. You guessed it, the best armor in class. The damage overall is about the same. We're on a fine steel Paramirian, and that's giving us 72 swing damage, which is just about mid-range, if not the bottom end of mid-range. And when I say bottom end of mid-range, I mean that there's like one other person who does less damage than the Paramirian. So take that as you will when it comes to damage, but I honestly feel that that's okay. The infantryman is supposed to hold the line. Having really strong armor and at least moderate to low damage is totally fine by me, as long as you have other things that can help out. Cavalry being one of them, which the Imperials have in spades. Now the other thing, and what I was going to talk about, is the Pila, or Pilum, if you're looking at this from a historical standpoint. So this is a throwable weapon, and the reason I say put the Trained Infantrymen and the Veteran Infantrymen and even Legionaries in a separate category, Veteran and Legionaries together, Trained Infantrymen apart, because you have to press hold fire for Veteran Infantrymen, or else they will throw the Pila. And if they do, that is a one-shot, one-use, one-throwable weapon. So they lose the quote-unquote spear functionality of the Pila if they do this. In addition to, the Pila is extremely short, so even if they do use it as a spear, it has limited reach and functionality to the point that they would probably pull out their sword over their spear. they're typically supposed to use whichever one has a higher skill or fits the situation better. And that situation is dictated by range to the enemy. Now, one-handed 100 and polearm 100 means it's at a tie, and they'll probably, because of reach, go for their sword over that spear. So keep that in mind. It's a one-shot weapon. Only have fire at will on if you want them to throw that pila. With your trained infantrymen, throw the javelins. That's the point of them. You don't need to hold on to those for any point or any reason. Now, another big thing about the veteran infantryman is that you get access to a nice, good, big shield. So that is a nice, huge advantage that you get at tier 4, which makes them a overall high rank. Now, moving over to the Manavliaton, we have the beginning of the two-handed weapons for the Empire. So they have the best armor, but they also have the lowest damage. That is a bit of a hamstring when it comes to the class itself, the two-handed weapon class. And I think the Manavliaton is very strong, but it does have a polearm where almost everyone else has a two-handed weapon. The only other class that doesn't, or another faction that doesn't, would be the Falks. I'm sorry, no, that's a two-handed weapon as well. I'm thinking of its Romphalia, which we'll get to in a bit. But the Manavliaton, being a polearm, means it has a very long range. So this makes it devastating against cavalry that is charging into you. So the Manavliaton is essentially going to be your anti-cav, versus all of the other factions have a very long spear in their infantry soldier at tier 4. So that's how you're really going to be using the Manavliaton versus the other factions who use their two-handed weapon infantry as more of a shock infantry, break the line. I mean, the Sturgians even have it called line breaker. So having that difference is huge, because they are very tanky, especially compared to the other two-handed infantry variants. And they do have a very large reach over their two-handed weapon counterparts. So you do have to factor that into this. So I give these guys a high rank because they are so tanky and because they can fit that anti-cavalry role that the veteran infantrymen can't fit as well. So they do have an actual place in your army, versus the two-handed infantry. I feel like they're always a nice to have, but never a compulsory option. So kind of look at that as you will when it comes to building out your Empire roster. Now, the veteran archer is where we start to take a bit of a dive for the Empire roster at tier 4. Overall, terrible armor. I mean, their armor for almost everything else is better than the veteran archer. I think Sturgia is the only one who gets mildly outclassed by the veteran archer in the armor department. But here's the biggest thing. This is an archer. I want it to shoot arrows, and I want it to do it really well. Well, he has a terrible bow with the simple short bow. In addition to that, he has 1 stack of barbed arrows. Everyone else gets 2 stacks, and if not better, a stack of arrows and a better bow. So he's really, again, lackluster at what he does. It's bad when Sturgia has a better archer than you. So the Imperial Veteran Archer, I mean, I really can't say more about it. It's I'm giving it a low rating because of those things. It doesn't even make up for it in skills, which is unfortunate. It doesn't have, oh, it's got a really great bow skill, so at least it's going to fire more often or more damage, something like that. It doesn't have that benefit. Now, moving over to our Imperial Crossbowman, we have this only competing against one other crossbowman from Volandia. Now, it actually has good armor. Volandia just barely has a little bit better armor above the Imperial Crossbowman. In fact, we can actually bring this one up. I think it's the hardened crossbowman at this point. Yeah, so it's just barely above. But I will say what I like about the Volandian crossbowman is it's a little bit more dynamic. It has a nice big huge pavus that it can use to defend itself. It's got this ridge-tipped arming sword. So it has a little bit more functionality when it runs out of this one single stack of bolts, which of course the Imperial Crossbowman has as well. So it has, in addition to that, not a good crossbow. 85 pierce damage on this bad boy versus the Hickory crossbow of this one at 93. So bad crossbow, decent armor, but no shield. I find that the Volandian hardened crossbowman just stacks up better against the Imperial Crossbowman, which I'm putting at a mid rank because it still does do its job, which is shoot bolts decent enough. It just can't really do anything outside of that. So to recap here for tier 4, we have the Imperial Veteran Infantryman at high rank, the Manavliaton at a high rank, then the Veteran Archer at a low rank, with the Crossbowman at a mid rank as well. Let's move over to the biggest, the baddest in tier 5 for the Empire. And tier 5 is a very strong showing for the Empire. Let's get started with the Imperial Legionary, because this is, I think, the one that you think of the most when you go into Empire infantry, because it has the best armor. Now, not only does it have the best armor, it also has the best armor for its weight. At 34 weight, everyone else has at least 10 more weights to catch up to that. Now, I don't know if that actually affects the speed of the unit overall for the AI, but I know for your character, it drastically does. And having 130 athletics on top of that means these guys are going to have some wheels on them to get downrange nice and fast. They do also have the Pila, so they'll be launching that downrange. You do have to turn off fire at will, so they'll retain that if you want to use them, that Pila, for an actual polearm, anti-cav, spear situation. But in addition to that, they also have the lowest damage, keeping that fine steel Paramirian as from the veteran infantrymen that they had. They do get a nice benefit here, though. Tiers 2, or I'm sorry, they have 2 other equipment sets that give them maces. Now that is huge. The Kalrodic Mace allows them to do a lot of really good damage, especially to other tier 5 heavily armored infantry that can really just crack them open. So I really like that. In my mind, that really kind of tips the Imperial Legionary above the rest, because they have really amazing armor. They have got good shields. They at least have a throw ability and polearm with the Pila, but that mace just allows them to threat up outside of their bracket so much better. And there's really nothing better than them. So I'm all about it. So Imperial Legionary gets that high rank from me. Moving into the elite Manavliaton, though, we get a little bit of a weird situation. So this is like the first time the armor's been dethroned in the infantry category for Imperial. The Imperial Elite Manavliaton has the second best armor of its class. It's outperformed by, I believe, the Azurai Palace Guard. Let's bring that up real quick. Yeah, these guys just are veritable tanks. So you can see this is the kind of competition these guys are going up against. And also the Heroic Linebreaker just got some new armor as well in the most recent set of patches. So it as well got changed from the Ulfhednar, or the Ulfhednar, to this guy, which is just a beast. So the Manavliaton has not really been touched since the game came out, and it kind of shows here. Its armor was tweaked, I think, in patch 1.3, 1.4, and it still just can't stack up to the rest of the units that have gotten a nice passover on this, including the Falksman, which no longer has a Falks, now has a Romphilia at its top end. So the Elite Manavliaton still has its Manavlion, which is great. It's cool. But it's not a great tier 5 weapon. And it has a fine steel Spatho, so at least it has some functionality, and it gets a Pila, so it can throw weapons. So it does have versatility, which I think still keeps it strong. It's just the low damage of the Manavlion doesn't compare to especially the Romphalia on the Britannians. That thing just does so much damage. So Manavliaton, in my mind, gets a mid rank because it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, in that it's a two-handed shock, quote-unquote, infantry unit, as well as everything else. But everything else it can do, it does very well. 130 polearm, 130 one-handed, so it still can threaten things, especially if you're doing sieges, stuff gets up close and personal. It's got a fine steel Spatha to actually threaten back with. When you take a look at the Mamluk Guard, it just has the Executioner's Axe, which is still a very strong, really great weapon, but it's harder to get those two-handed weapon swings in, especially if you're doing a really close melee or a siege warfare. So it's important to kind of note that. Moving over to our Palatine Guard, we have another awesome archer on the list, and this one has 160 bow skill. The only thing that compares to that in the non-noble line would be the Azurai Master Archer, who also has 160 bow skill. This time, though, the bow is upgraded. You know, nice step war bow, very strong. Other things have the recurve bow. Around this damage range is at 62. This has got a nice 66. But again, low ammo. We got bodkin arrows, which are solid, but only 24 shots. So that is a little bit of a hampering, but it also still has amazing armor and decent melee. So I do give this a high rank because it does have a lot of survivability from that good melee and that good armor, and the huge step up in damage from the bow is massive. I just think it needs more arrows. It really is lackluster in that arrow department, and especially, like I said, if Stygia's got more arrows than you and a variably much worse bow and loadout, it's a bit of an issue. But a high rank on the Palatine Guard, because it still is an impressive high bow damage and accuracy archer for the Imperials. Now, the Bucellarii, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, is a different case. This has some very stiff competition. It has the best non-noble line horse archer to deal with in the heavy Mamluk cavalry. Let's go to Mamluk heavy cavalry. This guy is just a beast. He's got a sword, he's got a shield, he's got a really good bow, he's got some really great arrows, and he's got a very fast horse. And it just doesn't compare with this character. I mean, this guy has got a terrible horse at tier 5 with the charger. His bow is a step reef curve bow, which is nice. He gets 2 stacks of arrows, which is better than even the Palatine Guard had, but he just has a sword. So as far as horse archers go, he's great if he's just shooting bows an arrow stationary, but if he's on his horse, he's trying to be mobile. He just can't compare to this character or anything from the Khazate as well. And the Khazate, we gave that a medium rank or mid rank because they have a noble line that just crushes the horse archer department. So while this character is not, or the Bucellarii is not terrible on its own, it has the lowest armor of the 3, it has the slowest and lowest maneuverability of the 3, so it really kind of doesn't stack up to the competition as well. So, and it has a very limited functionality. We looked at this character, and it has a sword, a shield, a bow and arrow, so it can do more in close combat if it runs out. This character, if it runs out, it's only got a sword, so it's not going to be as strong. So I think all those things make for a low rank for the Bucellarii just because of that. And it is unfortunate. I do think if I'm only looking at this roster, I think it's great because it does bring a nice, decently armor. I mean, I say lowest armor, but it's still a good amount of armor on a horse archer to the Imperial roster, but everything else that is in its category just outclasses it. Moving over to our last unit here, the Imperial Sergeant Bowman. Now, this is going to be compared to the Valandian Sharpshooter. Since there's only one in class, we can take a look directly. And it does have better armor, so it's got a little bit more survivability than the Valandian Sharpshooter. And you'll remember when we did the Valandian archery range, when we talked about their crossbowmen, we compared them to all the other archers because it's the only fair comparison. You take a look at this, you have two actual tiers where there's no other crossbowmen in tier. But when we take a look at the Imperial roster, they have archers they can compare against, so we just did the crossbowmen on a 1-to-1. Now, the other issue here is the Imperial Sergeant, while having better armor, has a lower damage bow. This is the Hickory crossbow. This is the same crossbow that the Hardened crossbowman had. The Valandian Sharpshooter has a bound crossbow, 100 pierce damage versus the Imperial's 93. So you do get better armor, you get lower damage output, but you still have solid melee ability here because you retain the fact that you've got a sword, and now you gain a small, if not effective, shield. So I would give these guys a mid-rank if I'm comparing them strictly crossbow to crossbow. If I'm comparing them to other archers like we did for Valandia, I would give them definitely a low rank. They just don't have enough arrows to shoot down range. Everything else outclasses them when it comes to skill and bow and arrow, or even crossbow in this case. So that is something to kind of consider when you're looking at them across other archer variants. So just to recap here real quick, Legionary is at a high rank. We have a mid for the Manavliaton. Then the Palatine Guard brings us back up to high. Bucellarii dropping us down low with a low rank. And then the Sergeant Crossbowman with a mid rank. Let's talk about our Noble line to quickly conclude our video. Now, the Noble line for the Imperials just got a pass in 1.4, I want to say, or 1.3. I'm not sure which one 100%. But the Vizsla Recruit just got a reduction in its overall loadout. Its helmet changed drastically. It used to be a nice, really cool Corinth style helmet. It is no longer that way, but it is still a pretty solid unit for a tier 2 infantry soldier. Now, it is, of course, meant to progress into your cavalry, so it's not long for being on foot. I give it a mid-rank for just simply being a decent, strong, tier 2 infantry soldier that compares very well to other tier 2 infantry soldiers. Now, moving up to the Equite, we get a very strong first showing of cavalry. And I give this one a mid-rank, and I'm really trying to get quickly down to tier 6, because that's the one we really care about when we're talking about noble lines. But I give it another mid-rank. I find that the Gallant for the Volandians just stacks up better against it. The Volandian just has more armor to deal with, has better skills, and has a better horse. And you're going to find that that's going to be a big issue with Imperial going forward. Now, as we move into the Heavy Horseman, we're going to get a high rank, because this time the Heavy Horseman has better equipment, both armor and weapons, than Volandia, and a really tanky horse here with the half-scale barding. But its biggest attractor, yet again, is that Imperial Charger. Volandia already gets access to the Volandian Corsair as early as tier 3. So from now on, tiers 4, 5, and 6 for Imperial, only going to be the Imperial Charger. And that is going to be very unfortunate, because it kind of makes them a little lackluster as a cavalry unit, because there's no higher tier Imperial, quote unquote, horse. I think that Tail Worlds could just simply put a different horse on the top ones, and who cares if it's not culturally the same. It just needs to have the ability to threaten upward. Now, into the Cataphract, we jump back into mid because the Volandian champion, and now we're taking a look at the Druznik for the, almost said Russians, for the Sturgians, and we have the Kagan Guard, I believe it is, for Kazate. Is it Kagan? Is that what that is at that point? Is it that's the one? Keshig, sorry. So we definitely have a lot more competition in this realm, especially opening up into Sturgia and having a lot better armor on some of those units. So the Imperial Cataphract still good, but it has lost its mace. It used to have a mace on one, if not two, of its equipment loadouts, and they have lost that as of some of the more recent patches. So their ability to threaten into armor has been drastically reduced. And that goes very well here for the Elite Cataphract. Now, you probably guessed it, they have the best armor. Leaps and bounds above the other. I mean, the other top tier, I think, was like 55 body armor. They've got 73, so you can see that they just have such a strong loadout of armor. But again, it's the same thing that we get from the infantry. Just medium damage. They do have a nice Imperial Lance that is much longer than the other ones, and they have changed this to the Imperial Lance from the Cataphract Lance that they had before. The Cataphract Lance was a two-handed lance that you could not brace, so that has changed. And in that as well, we have lost the mace on these characters. So the equipment loadout for the Elite Cataphract used to be better, I would say. I think it was better as of like 1.5, but it has changed recently to kind of create some balance between all the heavy shock cavalry units in the game, especially across the noble line ones, and it has still a terrible horse with the Imperial Charger, and that makes it very unfortunate. So I would unfortunately have to give this guy a mid-rank, whereas if we had looked at this, I think 3 patches ago, it would have been a different story. But now their skills even are not, they don't stack up. Let's take a look at a Banner Knight. And we're going to type in also the Druznik champion. So taking a look at these 3, you'll see that it used to be that the polearm skill was higher on the Cataphract, but lower on the Banner Knight. Now, if we look at let's look at the skills that matter. 200 riding, 200 one-handed, 260 polearm. Well, this is 200 riding, 220 one-handed, and 260 polearm. And it's a lance that is not that much lower in reach. The Imperial Lance is longer, but not that much longer. So you're basically losing 20 skill for a longer lance, more or less. In addition, like I said, Volandian Corsair here is just a much better horse. Even looking at the Druznik, we have a character that has got 220 one-handed, so it still has better one-handed than the Elite Cataphract, which, I'll be honest, was needed. This unit was in terrible shape and has finally kind of been brought up to snuff a little bit here. Still not as amazing as it once as the other ones, but is a lot better than it once was. So you've got a unit now that has no ability to threaten into armor with maces, and just 20 less one-handed is kind of lackluster here. So just to quickly recap, mid-rank on the Vizsla, the mid rank here on the Equite, high rank on the Heavy Horseman, then mid rank on the Cataphract, and mid rank on the Elite Cataphract. And at that, it brings our video to a close on the unit guide. Now, I'm going to flash up all the ranking systems that I've given to everything so you can see all the low, mids, and highs that I've kind of doled out to everyone. And my overall consensus on the Imperial unit guide, or I'm sorry, unit roster, is that it has changed. It used to be that they were disproportionately better than every other class, more or less. I mean, you had some things that would do a lot better when you take a look at the noble lines for, say, the Battanians, and having all their archers just crush everything else. But the Palatine Guard has been scaled back in its armor. Same thing with the Veteran Archer. Same thing with the Bucellarii. The Legionary, I think it was the Veteran Infantryman or the Legionary lost. Oh no, the Veteran Infantryman lost its javelins and gained the Pila, and the Imperial Infantryman lost its javelins. So, and the Imperial Elite Manavliaton has had its armor changed, I think around, like I said, in 1.3.1.4. Same thing with the crossbowmen. So there's been a toning back of the Imperial armor. At the same time, though, I feel like it's not been able to catch up, and everything else has moved up in its damage output to the point where, yes, you do have the best armor across the entire roster on average with all of its units. But I feel like, especially with the archers, there's just so many glaring holes. It needs to have more stacks of arrows, or there needs to be something like just a higher quantity of them to fill out that gap of less arrows being used per archer. So take that into consideration when you are building your Imperial roster, or maybe if you want to make a mixed roster, you now know that the Imperial Legionary is the end-all be-all of tanky frontline infantry. But hopefully we will see more changes to these units as the game gets closer to official launch. I'm sure that this is going to, last 2 times we did this, all the units changed the day or two after the guide came out. So be on the lookout for that. Let me know in the comment section below how you want me to deal with updating these guides. Do you want me to just do a whole new re-guide for everything? Or do you want me to just do one catch-all video that mainly touches on the ones that have changed drastically in their unit grade because of some of the changes from Tale Worlds? But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment below, all that kind of fun action. But have a good one and take care.